everybody. Thanks for joining us again today for our weekly Science Talk webinar series. We are continuing to explore Research Thrust C, which examines how cities can intentionally foster the widespread adoption of infrastructure, development patterns, consumer behaviors, and management practices that advance sustainable water management. I hope to see you all here next week for a presentation from Dr. Alex Moss, exploring how to finance transitions to One Water. As you all know, we are recording these and I post them to our YouTube channel as well as the UN website, but feel free to turn on your mic and your webcam and engage with our presenter for today, either during his presentation or at the end. So with that, I'm excited to introduce Timothy Kirby, a PhD candidate at Florida International University in Earth Systems Science with a concentration in environmental economics and policy. His dissertation research focuses on the political economy of climate change in Southeast Florida and its effects on the barriers to implementing climate solutions. He received his bachelor's in sustainable development from Columbia University and just recently became a graduate research fellow for the National Socio-Environmental Synthesis Center, SESYNC, where he conducted research on climate gentrification pathways along the East Coast of the United States. So congratulations on that, Tim. That's really exciting, and look forward to your presentation. I know we can hear you and see your charming face, so go ahead and take it away.
Thank you, Sarah. So today, I'm just going to be talking about Project C2-1, using dynamic information acceleration to understand and forecast homeowner adoption of new technologies for sustainable water management. So the last time, my presentation focused on our research contributions, specifically how it advances the science and practice of managing sustainable water systems. To take from what I did the last time when I presented, what I like to focus on is that our project was based on a stakeholder-driven research design, which means that our results are likely to be relevant to decision-making. And second, our methodology tests and further examines a way to both educate and survey homeowners in an innovative way. Therefore, there's a potential for interfacing the results of this work to other UN modeling efforts so that, for example, we have a better idea of what is plausible in terms of homeowner adoption numbers. And finally, because we're learning about what factors drive adoption, we can offer support for water managers by crafting policy recommendations and highlighting areas for additional engagement and education. But now I want to combine these contributions with the research questions that we posed in our experiment to highlight our recommendations going forward for academics and practitioners. For example, our research questions that we sought to answer were, is there a decrease or a difference or an increase in the willingness to adopt after entering the choiceful environment? Second, are participants more likely to shift on perceptions of gray water given a number of different factors? And how important are these specific factors in the willingness to adopt gray water systems? And last, which strategies seems to have the most effect on shifts in willingness to adopt? So in looking at the first question, is there any increase or difference in willingness to adopt after entering the choiceful environment? What we found, and I'm not going to go into many details or graphs or anything like that, because I just wanted to focus on very high level results and just explain it, that in this environment, we could not reject our null hypothesis was that there is no difference in the willingness to adopt before or after entering the choice flow environment. And we tried many different statistical tests, especially like chi-square tests and Kruskal-Wallis tests, but we found that there was no statistically significant difference in things like total time spent in this environment, the metro area in which we were studying, and we had many different sites from Phoenix to Denver to the Miami, Fort Lauderdale area, including Baltimore. And what we found across those metro areas is that the time spent, the income level, and the highest education, we did not find any statistical significant difference in people's willingness to adopt gray water systems. And so this brings up a lot of questions about, how much this information and decision making at the time, really is affected by where you live or your income or your highest education level. But what it did allow us to do is to proceed with treating the entire population as one. There have been additional analysis where we did try to parse out, specific areas, whether or not it's the metro area or specific time spent. But a lot of our analysis focuses on the population as a whole, because through our analysis, we found that there was no difference in people's willingness to adopt. Second, when we were looking at our research questions of were participants more likely to shift on their perceptions of gray water, and second, how important were those particular factors in the willingness to adopt? Some of the things that we were able to sort of parse out were, for example, environmental attitudes. What I used was what's called the new environmental paradigm, which is a very standard test that is basically used to assess environmental attitudes. And so in this case, I did try to see, based on general area, were there any sort of differences in environmental attitudes? And there was a statistically significant difference between metro areas, with Baltimore actually having the highest NEP average, followed by Portland in terms of their overall environmental attitudes, meaning that they have a much more positive environmental attitude towards like things like adoption of efficiency appliances, as well as like other environmentally conscious beliefs. But however, when trying to use that environmental attitudes and compare that to whether or not, if you have a more positive environmental attitudes, whether that would shift your perceptions on gray water, we were not able to reject the null hypothesis. And so what we found is that environmental attitudes doesn't necessarily make you more likely to adopt gray water than someone else who doesn't have, a more positive environmental attitude. But one of the things that we did see, though, is that when looking at the adoption of other efficiency appliances, that we did see that there was a statistically significant result in that those who are more likely to have or be aware that they have efficiency appliances were more likely to adopt gray water systems. However, in addition, in looking at timescales, because we asked questions, is if you were more likely to, if you were going to adopt a gray water system, in which timescale were you more likely to adopt it? And our results showed a shift toward a highly likelihood adoption from the 5 to 10 year timescales. I don't know if anybody remembers like my last presentation where I did pop up some graphs where it showed that significant shift, from not, from being least likely to adopt to being more likely. But, we acknowledged at the time that that preference to delay could be explained by other factors. But for a researcher or practitioner in a particular area studying gray water solutions, when homeowners are more likely to invest in a system will help generate solutions to maximize adoptions. And the last thing that we were able to see where there was some significant information in terms of what we can do for further analysis, as well as for practitioners, was looking at cost. For example, most of our participants listed that they would want to spend less than $500 on a gray water system, followed by the second highest being between $500 and $1,000. In addition, like our questions that we asked were followed up. What was the importance of certain factors in determining their willingness to adopt? And over 80% of our respondents listed that a government rebate program was more likely to influence their decisions to adopt. So when you're looking at how much people are willing to invest in a gray water systems versus like what sort of incentives would allow them to go forward with it, such as a government rebate, this allows practitioners to be able to see what sort of government rebate or tax incentives that they can do that would very much keep that investment within either a less than 500 or between a 500 to $1,000 range to sort of maximize adoption likelihood. And then last, when we were focusing on which strategy seems to have the most effect on shifts in willingness to adopt, while additional analysis on this question is being conducted, what we do know is that participants sought out information from their neighbor first at a statistically significant higher rate than the others, with the computer being a far second. Also, in our area for feedback, people found the neighbor video most helpful in understanding the system, with some comments even mentioning that it changed their minds about wanting to adopt. So therefore, in looking at what sort of recommendations, pragmatic recommendations that we would present to any sort of addition for any academic or any practitioner in order to advance sustainable water technological adoptions, we found that our research has shown that over 60% of respondents across our research areas said that they would be more likely to adopt a gray water system if some or most of their neighbors have positive experiences with gray water systems, bringing to the mix the neighbor effect on technological adoption and diffusion. One area where we were surprised to see results was that over 60% of our respondents across research areas were not distressed at all from the idea of using gray water for outdoor irrigation, making things like the disgust factor a lesser issue for practitioners to be concerned with. Third, as I mentioned before, our respondent feedback highlighted areas that could need additional investigation and education for the community. Some examples from this feedback include how HOA regulations can impede potential adopters from making investments, to supporting monthly or yearly maintenance and support for the types of soaps and other cleansers that would need transitioning to. And then whether current building codes in particular areas would even allow the installation of gray water systems. And also, while our research focused purely on homeowners and single-family homes, for sustainability purpose, we must also assess how and if implementations of these systems on new and existing multi-unit developments is economically and socially feasible, as we find that current solutions to issues such as the housing crisis focus on things like increased density. And so that is my presentation, and I just opened it up for questions.
Thanks, Timothy. Any questions for Tim?
Hey, Tim, I got one. Now, you got that one slide. We talk about people adoption timeframes.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that is this.
Yeah, I was just wondering, I mean, maybe we've even talked about this before, but I mean, you know, it's easy for me to say I'm going to do something further down the road, like a discounting thing, right? And I wonder if you've thought about that. Is that all we're seeing here? I mean, or is there something you feel like there's something more real going on that people could actually do this, or you know what I'm saying? It's just easy to say you're going to do it later on.
Yes. Well, one thing I can definitely say is that like this experiment did not calculate like at the beginning, ask that question if they were doing it, because the purpose of it is once the information is presented for you, like, would you do it sort of now as opposed to later? And so like after like basically dynamic information acceleration just projects people into a time where if given the information, how would they make decisions from that point? And to your point, I do agree that it can be like, okay, well, right now, I'm not looking to do it, but I think that speaks more to how they view their current water situation. And what I can say is that across research areas, and hence the reason why I was able to treat all of our participants as one, is that even in areas where you would think that there would be much more of a constraint in terms of water resources available, we did not see statistically significant differences in when they would be more likely to choose to adopt it. So whether or not they're in Denver, or whether or not they're in Phoenix, which is typically areas where water resources are more constrained, they had the exact same, or excuse me, there were no statistically significant differences between when they would adopt, versus an area like Baltimore or an area like Miami, Fort Lauderdale, which have less of an issue when it comes to water resources. And so what that allows us to see, not necessarily sort of looking at when someone would more likely to adopt, but sort of looking at as a population, everyone is sort of seeing their the impact to their immediate like water systems. They don't see them any differently. In fact, they just see them, okay, well, 5-10 years down the road, I think I'm more likely to do that rather than right now. And so that could lead to some other things and some additional analysis to see why is that across these research areas.
Hi, Tim. I'm wondering about if there was any consideration of the aesthetics of gray water in this willingness to adopt. And I apologize if maybe you already made a mention of this, but was the assumption kind of that the aesthetics in terms of like maybe visual appearance and any odor or anything would not be an issue, or how was that handled, I guess?
So we did sort of discuss factor, and we asked questions just based off of the available research, where we did ask questions about basically how distressed were you about the idea of using recycled water for outdoor irrigation. And I mentioned that over 60% of respondents across the research areas were not distressed at all. So we had, we had a range from, very disgusted to not distressed or very distressed to not distressed at all. And what we found is that over 60% were not distressed at all for using gray water for outdoor irrigation. But what I will say is that a lot of what they were focusing on, as you see here, when it comes to educational needs, there are issues such as cost of maintenance and, actually behavioral switches that they will have to make in addition to installing this system. So I think it was, from what we're seeing, it was less about the discuss of using recycled water for outdoor, so much as this what sort of behavioral changes that they would have to make in order to feel comfortable with adopting a gray water system in their home.
Thanks, Tim. I have a question. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. So did you look at any income differences in people's willingness to adopt? Because it seems like this would be a water conservation issue, and if the price of water is higher and income is lower, then people might be more likely to consider it if they had the money to invest. But it just seems like economics would come into the play here.
Yes, and we did ask questions specifically when it came to not only shifts in willingness to adopt, but additional analysis. And I'm sorry that I did not post it up on there, on looking at income level and how much they would be willing to pay. And what I saw is that across income levels, most people were still within that $500 to $1,000 range in terms of willingness to invest or willingness to pay, for a gray water system. And so I would say that, to your point, yes, it is an economic issue. But what we did see was that, in terms of looking at income level, that there wasn't any sort of statistically significant differences between those on a lower income scale versus the higher income scale on how much they would be willing to pay for a gray water system.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Great, thanks for chiming in with some questions. Sybil, do you have another one?
Just wanted to make a comment that this is really interesting, Tim. Thank you for the presentation. And as a take, I really like the points that you made with respect to the importance of maintenance and time input for the system. And I think that's a really important message to carry away for people working in the technologies, to say that as much as possible, technologies need to remain simple to operate, and automations are going to be important as well, and figuring out how to have some sort of autonomous control on these systems and how you do that at a household scale. I think that that's an important finding to kind of drive the technological advancements that come up. So just wanted to thank you for your insight there.
Thank you.
Tim, I'm wondering if you've looked at like the broader like water conservation literature. I'm just reminded that the efforts at water conservation here in Tucson have been in place for 50 years, and it's this sort of slow, gradual change. And I wonder if it might be the same with like gray water uptake. That like you noted, the neighbors have to. Someone wants to know, well, George down the street did this and it worked, so now I'm willing. And I'm just wondering if there's some literature out there in the broader water conservation literature about this sort of these gradual changes that would help provide you with some insight. And maybe you've already looked there. I don't know. So,
yes, I mean, I have, and I've also done some expert interviews in the meantime as I was building this experiment, just to get an idea on how practitioners are even looking at a system such as gray water. And while they see the benefits, technological benefits of, of using gray water, they actually had, some limited issues in terms of how that affects their bottom line, in terms of, well, if they are not using, if they're recycling water, then they're not using more water, which means that, the revenue coming in, could be impacted. But then, also from an expert level, they were also asking, well, and then, which was my last point, was from an actual building perspective, like how is it, I mean, it makes much more economical sense, for new units to already include these systems, as opposed to retrofitting older systems. And again, the types of maintenance and the types of changes that would be need to made from an already existing standpoint versus using it as a build. And additionally, like from those interviews, I also gathered that, for those people who are early adopters, they would see these as an incentive to move into a house or to a multi-unit, as opposed to an existing homeowner, retrofitting their.
No, retrofit definitely would be a lot more expensive. I mean, here, the Tucson Water here in Southern Arizona here, gosh, about 12 years ago, worked with the Home Builders Association to essentially work at the county level to have a mandate that all new construction would have a gray water stub out. So just in the design of the plumbing, they'd go, okay, kitchen sink, toilets, black water, everything else goes to gray. I think the Home Builders Association estimated it would be like $500 extra per house. Like, it's not, you're selling a $200,000 house, $500 is not the end of is not a deal breaker. But yeah, retrofits can be significantly more expensive. So yeah, no, thanks, Tim. I enjoyed it. So
Thank you.
Okay, any other questions or comments for Tim?
Well, I'll just say, I think another thing to take away from this is the importance of neighbors and this whole social interaction around, you know, how these new technologies are adopted. I think that's a really important lesson, and I think it applies across a broad spectrum of, you know, homeowners' adoptions of things. And you can see it. I see it in my neighborhood now with solar panels in Boston, right? So the state comes out with a new program, and so one neighbor does it, and you can see there's kind of this chipping where then other people will do it. So that's a really powerful tool in the arsenal of how these strategies get implemented. So thank you.
Thank you.
Great. Well, thanks for your feedback, everyone. And Tim, thank you so much for your presentation and your insights today. It's great to see you all. Thanks for turning cameras on too. It's lovely to see your faces. Hope you all can tune in next week. We're going to be shifting gears a little bit to talk about the money aspect and how we finance these, adoptions and transitions to more sustainable water systems and approaches. So hope to see you next week. Take care, stay safe out there, and have a great afternoon, everybody.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.